We have another keynote speaker. Our next keynote speaker is Dr. Stacey Patton, who is an adoptee and child abuse survivor turned award-winning journalist, author, child advocate, and college professor. She teaches digital journalism at Howard University and is a research associate at Morgan State University Institute for Urban Research. She is the author of That Mean Old Yesterday, a memoir, Spare the Kids, Why Whipping Children Won't Save Black America, and the forthcoming Strung Up, The Lynching of Black Children in Jim Crow America. Welcome, Dr. Patton.
Good evening, beautiful people. I hope you all are doing well. I'm wondering if we could all do a little exercise together. If I could get everybody to unmute their microphones just for a quick second. So if everybody could just go ahead, unmute your microphone. Give everybody a second to do that. And I want us to all together say one very simple but powerful sentence together. Everybody ready to do that? Let me get a thumbs up. Okay. All right. So everybody, on the count of 3, I want you to repeat after me. And I want you to say this with passion. Okay. A lot of passion. All right. On the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Childhood is about surviving. Adult. Okay, so y'all can mute those mics now. Go ahead and mute your mics back. Give everybody a chance to mute. All right, childhood is about surviving adults. Now I know a lot of people here can relate to that, both the adults and the young folks in this room. I am Dr. Stacey Patton. I am case number KC114343 from New Jersey's foster care system. I'm an adoptee, child abuse survivor. I aged out of the foster care system back in the late 1990s. I was lucky enough while I was in foster care to win a full scholarship to go to boarding school, which was really my escape out of the foster care system. And when I got this opportunity, I made this promise, this commitment that when I grew up, when I became an adult, that I would use my voice, my ability to write, my ability to think, to advocate for children, for young people, and particularly those who were victims of child abuse. And I would use my voice and my mind to argue against a very controversial issue in our culture, which is corporal punishment, spanking, whooping, popping, those sorts of things. Everybody, by a show of hands, how many of you all got spanked as a kid? Let's see, let me see your hands raised. Spanked, whoop, pop, beat, whatever you want to call it. Let me see your hands. Yep, they're coming up. I see y'all. Okay. So quite a number of people, probably most people. Yep, I still see the hands going up. All right. Yep. All right. And so, you know, a lot of people will say, I was whooped as a child, I was spanked as a child, and I turned out fine. Well, I was whooped as a child, and I turned out so fine that I'm using the rest of my life to try to convince parents everywhere to stop using this parenting practice, because it is so damaging to young people's development, to how their brains develop, to how they communicate, to how they think about themselves, how they relate to others. You know, we talk a lot about, you know, domestic violence, but hitting your child, someone that you're supposed to love and protect, is also a form of domestic violence, and is often at the root of adult domestic violence. So this evening, I want to talk with you about this controversial practice and destroy some myths about this practice, because I believe that we can shift and change culture through young people. We can heal families and communities through young people. We can break cycles of pain and violence and trauma through young people. We can fight racism and other social problems and public health issues with young people who are strong, who are healthy, who know how to regulate their emotions, who know how to think critically. And quite frankly, folks, a lot of my work that I deal with on this issue is with Black and Brown families and communities. The reality is, when we look at America, the future demographic looks like the people in this room, is people of color. And so we have to be poised in this country to create a new kind of future for America, to heal the future, to create a more just future. And so we cannot do this with young people who are growing up being traumatized and broken down and beaten down by the very people who are supposed to love them. So let me hear you unmute your mics and let me know if you're ready to take this journey. Let me hear you say yes. Let's go.
Yes.
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 Oh,
Yes.
I don't believe y'all. It's still too quiet in here. Are you ready to take this journey with me?
Yes.
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 Okay. All right. Now I feel the love. Okay. So I'm going to warn you all. Okay. Some of the things that you're going to see and hear during my presentation tonight are a little disturbing. So if you need to walk away to take care of yourself, please do so. Okay. You can come back when you're ready. But I just want to give you fair warning. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about history. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about science and medicine, the brain, right? I'm going to throw some statistics out. I'm going to talk about the school to prison pipeline. I'm going to talk about foster care to prison pipeline. So all of these different issues that intersect with this one parenting practice. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen now and show you a series of videos to give you some sense of how a lot of people talk about spanking, beating, whooping kids. Okay, so let me go to my share screen here, share my sound. Okay, and so the title of my talk is Sparing the Rod and Decolonizing Black Parenting. So I'll talk about what decolonizing means and why people of color, communities of color especially, need to decolonize everything. Right? Particularly how we think about children, our attitudes about them, the language we use, and how we handle their bodies and their psychology. Okay, so I'm going to start with this first video here. Play that for you.
Whoop your kids, whoop your kids, beat your kids' ass, beat your kids' ass, whoop your kids, whoop your kids, beat your kids' ass, beat your kids' ass, whoop your kids, whoop your kids, beat your kids' ass, beat your kids' ass, whoop your kids, whoop your kids, beat your kids' ass, beat your kids' ass, whoop your kids. Whoop your kids, beat your kids' ass, beat your kids' ass, whoop your kids, whoop your kids, beat your kids' ass, beat your kids' ass, whoop your kids, whoop your kids, beat your kids' ass, beat your kids' ass, whoop your kids, whoop your kids, beat your kids' ass, beat your kids' ass, whoop your kids, whoop your kids. Beat your kids' ass, beat your kids' ass, whoop your kids, whoop your kids, beat your kids' ass, beat your kids' ass, whoop your kids, whoop your kids, beat your kids' ass, beat your kids' ass, whoop your kids, whoop your kids, beat your kids' ass, beat your kids' ass.
So if you go onto YouTube and other social media platforms, you can see similar videos like this. There's a whole genre of rap videos that just put in, whoop your kids, and you'll see a bunch of these songs where rappers will talk about how awful this generation of young people is and how society is in disarray because young people aren't being beaten enough by their parents. And then there's always this warning to parents that if you don't whip your children, then the police will end up killing them. So this is one type of video that circulates. Let me go to the next one.
Hi, parents out there. I'm just here to demonstrate the proper whooping of a child. First, obtain the child, like so. Get a firm grasp. They might try to run, You might have to rough them up a little bit when they try to run. You hear me? Don't worry. Don't worry. The child, they know why you rough them up. They probably got bad grades. Once you secure the child like so, slam them. Secure the child onto the ground. Ask them, can they move? Can you move?
No.
Say yes. Can you move?
Yes.
Well, that's not good enough. Once you secure the child, you may want to tie them down.
What?
That's crazy.
Now, find a good belt. Some people like the old-fashioned belts with a big belt buckle. It's a commonly misperceived fact that they don't really work that way. Well, the child's trying to get away. Double the belt like so. Then you make an intimidating sound like this. That raises the child's heart rate considerably. Then begin beating. And thus, whooping 101. Thank you.
Like the previous video, there's a whole genre of tutorials on how to whoop a child. You can go onto YouTube and see these videos. They get millions of views, lots of comments, lots of shares on social media. So these are supposed to be jokes, but what they do is to help normalize this type of violence against children. And let me show you one last video. This is a video that I produced along with another filmmaker a few years ago, and I've shown this all across the country to parents, social workers, child welfare professionals, and so forth. This one is a bit more disturbing than the other videos that I showed. Black people have been parenting, legally parenting their children for only 150 years. Now, if you factor in Jim Crow, it's only 50 years. Toya Graham was not a hero for chasing down, cursing out, and assaulting her son on national television.
Get the f over here!
But I empathized with her fear. I understood why she needed to intervene in that moment. What I was disgusted by was the media circus created by it. We need you to be a mammy, that bridge between the interests of a white authority and your thug son.
Black people hit their child 92 times. In the eye, in the nuts, in the feet. That's where the real pop locking came from.
Goddamn. Goddamn. You don't remember what somebody used to say. I ain't doing no more. I ain't doing no more. I ain't doing no more. Goddamn, you won't even do it.
I will fuck a kid up. Don't get mad at me. I'm just saying what you can't say. You feel the same goddamn way I feel.
Wait. Why are you crying? Okay, listen. Switching. I'm about to lose this time. Yo, you don't come back? Huh? What's thinking I'm gonna freak it out? Get your butt in that house now.
If you check the latest statistics from the Department of Health and Human Services, last year alone, Black women, Black parents put 375 children in their graves as a result of child abuse. A disproportionate number of the perpetrators are Black women aged 40 and under. We need to deal with that reality.
It was love, and I wanted to really show that he's not a gangster. You know, we don't come from this. Tonight, the uncle of a slain teenager defends what he calls an act of love. The Terrytown teen made internet headlines after he was seen being disciplined by his uncle for claiming to be a gangster just last week. The young man was shot to death outside of his home.
Tell him about that. Tell him that. Tell him about that. Show him that. Show him that. Facebook that. The gang remember that? No, I'm going to leave last night too, huh? Raise your hand. I'm going to stomp your motherfucking ass.
Toya Graham and legions of other Black men and women are parenting their children under a racist system that is designed to distort and destroy and kill their kids. So what we have to stop doing as Black people is, becoming co-conspirators and participants in the dehumanization process.
I don't spank. I whoops. Yes, I was whooped, therefore I shall whoop.
Okay. Loud.
Bend over, bend over.
Mommy, he grabbed myself.
Say one more word. Say it.
Stop it, let me breathe.
So if we could all just take a deep breath after taking in those horrific sounds and images. These scenes might be familiar to some of you. Perhaps some of you experienced them yourselves, or you've witnessed it among friends, right? These are scenes that go down every single day in this country. And there are a lot of parents who actually love their children and do this to their bodies because there's a lot of fear of the police, fear of racism, fear of something happening to their children. But too often this type of child rearing practice ends up being counterintuitive, and we end up priming our children for the very outcomes that we're trying to protect them from with this parenting technique. So we see these videos, but we also see stuff like this, memes on social media that are supposed to be joking, right? And they circulate around on platforms like Facebook. And you see a lot of people sort of offering their own personal testimonies about being hit by their parents. You see stuff like this happening. So it's not just memes. There's TikTok is another more recent digital platform where people will joke about being hit. Sometimes you'll see on Instagram grown men who dress up to impersonate their mothers who beat them as children. You see a lot of internalized racism on these. So here is a young man who has vitiligo, which is an actual skin condition. And someone took this picture and turned it into a meme about a mom threatening to smack the Black off of them. So you see this particularly among Black and Brown communities. With Latinos, you see jokes about the chancleta. I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but also, about picking weapons to be beaten with. Okay. And so what I do when I talk with parents and communities about this practice, I have to decolonize their parenting or their thinking by challenging the ways that they've been given certain myths about spanking children. So one of the myths is that there's a difference between spanking and child abuse. This is untrue. So a lot of people think that, oh, if I hit my child and I don't leave a mark, I don't leave a bruise, I don't break something, then it's not abuse, it's not harmful. But we have more than 50 years worth of scientific research on hundreds of thousands of children across the world that shows that spanking your child actually harms their brain development. It causes inflammation in the body. There are all of these biological reactions that happen in a child's body before they're even hit. So for those of you who were spanked as kids, it started when your parent threatened to hit you. Think about how your body felt. Your hands got sweaty, your heart rate sped up, your breathing changed, your stomach started spinning. This is because your body at that time, before you're even being hit, is being flooded with neurochemicals, things like cortisol, which primes us to have what's called a fight or flight response. So you're gonna either run, so flee, you're gonna fight back. Most of us wouldn't dare fight back our parents or even run at that point, or just freeze. And so the brain does not know the difference between severe physical abuse that leaves marks, sexual abuse, or a spanking. Someone has their microphone on and I'm getting feedback. Can everybody mute their mics for me? I'm getting a lot of feedback in the background. Okay, thank you. So the brain does not recognize the difference between those three types of abuses. All three are stressful events that cause the brain and the body to react in the exact same way. So there are things that happen underneath the child's flesh and body that a parent does not see when they are threatening their child, yelling at their child, or hitting them. So there's no difference between those. And we've got decades of research to show this. So the American Academy of Pediatrics, it's the #1 organization that is all about preserving the health of children and teaching parents and other folks about what's good for kids and what's not good for kids. And they passed a resolution just a few years ago warning parents about the potential short and long-term health consequences to children's development. So a lot of people will say, I was spanked, I was whooped as a child and I turned out fine, but how is your body? How's your blood pressure, right? How's your psychology? Do you have a short temper? Do you have problems regulating your emotions, right? So sometimes the consequences of being hit as a child doesn't always show up during childhood or during puberty, but later on in young adulthood or over the lifespan, when somebody's having a stroke, when somebody has, having other chronic health issues. So toxic stress, like somebody hitting you as a little child, sometimes starting when you're an infant, your body keeps the score. It accumulates all of this stress in your body that you carry around with you, right? And it affects so many of the racial disparities in health that we see among Black and brown communities in this country. And it starts early in childhood when children are exposed to toxic stress events, on top of living in neighborhoods that are stressed out, dealing with crime, eco hazards, food deserts, and other types of environmental conditions, along with ancestral trauma that so many of our communities are walking around with, given the history of slavery, Jim Crow, anti-immigrant attitudes, sentiments, and treatment as well. So the AAP recommends against spanking children. The American Psychological Association also passed a resolution saying that it's harmful to spank children because of the ways in which it can impact their self-esteem, put children at risk for depression, drug abuse, suicide, becoming future victims or perpetrators of violence in their intimate relationships or with their own children. There's more than 1,600 studies that have shown that there are no benefits, absolutely zero benefits to hitting children. You will not find one legitimate scientific study that says that hitting children is good for them in any way. Instead, the scientific community has this consensus that says hitting children is bad for them. Hitting children is bad for society. It's bad for our communities. These are some of the major organizations, again, that are against hitting kids: the American Medical Society, the CDC, U.S. Centers for Disease Control, and so forth. So all of these studies tell us that spanking is ineffective for punishment. A lot of parents will say, well, you got to whoop your kids. And I ask people, well, you know, how many times did you hit your child? And most of them will say, well, definitely more than once. But if it was so effective, you would have only had to do it one time, right? So it's ineffective. It doesn't promote positive child behavior. And the latest research shows that spanking your child is just as harmful as abuse that leaves visible marks. So they've looked at brain scans of kids who've been spanked or adults who were spanked as children, and they see the same structural changes in the brain for kids who have been spanked as opposed to those who've experienced very severe forms of abuse. It's all the same. So striking children is a form of toxic stress. It can cause elevated hormone levels, obesity, depression, inflammation in the body, cellular aging. What cellular aging is, you have cells in your body that are responsible to help certain organisms operate well, your heart, your lungs, your kidneys, pancreas, stomach, digestive system, all of these things. But when you're subjected to toxic stress, it causes those cells to reproduce too early and break down and eventually die. And it weakens the immune system. It weakens your heart, all of those areas of the body that are supposed to be keeping you healthy. Okay. And also there have been a lot of studies that link this type of physical punishment to higher levels of aggression among children and intimate partner violence and other crimes in adulthood.
Dr. Patterson, are you taking questions now or later? Because we had a really good one in the chat, and I wanted to know if you wanted to.
It's your show. I'm here to serve you. So if you want to throw out a question now, I can definitely take them.
All right. So Francisco Salazar says, if this does not serve as a good method in disciplining a child, what can a parent do? There are parents who do not spank their children and they turn out to be brats. Excuse my language.
Okay, so I'm going to save that question to the end when we talk about solutions, if you don't mind. It's a great question. So let me move through this journey a little bit more and we'll talk about solutions at the end. Is that good? Is that a good deal?
I think that sounds good.
Okay. All right. So myth 2, and this is particularly for Black folks and other indigenous groups as well. So a lot of Black people I hear, they say, well, whipping children is a Black thing. It's something that we bought from Africa. There's absolutely no evidence that this is true whatsoever. A lot of Black folks will say, they stole everything from us, our names, our culture, our practices, we don't know who we are. But whipping children was the one thing that survived the Middle Passage experience. But the reality is that the majority of the enslaved people who got on those ships were actually kids. They were teenagers and kids as young as 7 or 8 years old. These are young people who hadn't yet finished childhood and hadn't yet parented yet. So they didn't all come from the same cultures. They didn't come from the same countries. They didn't all speak the same language. They didn't practice the same religions. They didn't hold the same conceptions of childhood or child rearing or how to discipline, a kid. They didn't all come here with this universal parenting guide that once they got here, it wasn't interfered with by slave masters and overseers. That's not how that happened. So I'm going to talk a little bit later about the ideas that West Africans had about children. And the same thing with indigenous people, right? A lot of people think that beating kids is something that's always been around forever, that it's universal, that everybody across the globe did it. That's not true. Indigenous folks in North America and South America did not believe in coercing and beating kids. Native Americans here did not believe in coercing and beating kids. West Africans, you can go across the globe and look at cultures, pre-colonized cultures, and see that they held totally different conceptions about children. So what actually happened was when Europeans began to colonize these different groups around the world, and they interfered with not just their land and their resources, but they colonized their thinking. They colonized their religious practices. They colonized parenting practices. And so it's to the point where we just think that beating kids is natural and that it's always been something that's been around forever, and it's not true. So what I've been arguing, this was an article that I wrote back in 2017 for the American Psychological Association. What I tried to do with professionals is to explain that corporal punishment in Black communities is not an intrinsic cultural tradition. It's not native to us. It's not natural to us. So the indigenous folks, Latinos, Asian folks, and Native Americans in this country, this type of parenting practice is not native to us. It's foreign. The fact that we practice it now is a result of internalized racism and racial trauma. This is something that was taught to us when we had contact with Europeans who put our communities under siege in different ways, starving us of resources, subjecting us to police brutality, subpar schooling, and so forth. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And so I always talk about decolonizing, indigenizing, resisting, reclaiming, reimagining. So we have to ask ourselves, how did we get here? How do we become a people who thinks it's okay to pick up cell phones, right? I teach digital journalism, so I know all the steps you need to do to pick up a camera, a cell phone, right? Make sure you and your child are in the frame, press record, and do this whole spectacle of shaming and beating your child, right? So you do that, you talk to them, you explain, and then you're beating. And then after that, you got to take that video. You got to have a YouTube page or Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is you have. And then you got to upload that thing. You got to give it a title. So you got to market it, right? And you upload this thing, and now you got to share it. So you go on and you say, this is what I had to do to my son or my daughter. So for potentially millions of people to see, right? And then you move that through social media, it goes viral, and the parent feels like, yay, I'm a good parent because look what I did with my kid. And people go in the comments and they say, we need more parents to be doing this with our kids. So many people say, these kids today are awful. And I'm like, well, your generation was on crack, or your generation, gave birth to these kids. If these kids today are so awful, it's because they are, a symptom of their environments or the parents and grandparents who raised them, okay? And all the data actually shows that these kids today are actually doing better than the previous generations. Teen pregnancy is down, drug abuse is down, right? Teen violence and arrests are down. All those social indicators show that young people today are actually doing much better from a sociological perspective than the previous generations.
Dr. Patton, I'm
yes.
sorry, we have another question.
Sure, go ahead, dear.
Mariana Hernandez asks, Child Protective Services has deemed spanking children okay. I'm sorry. As long as it is with an open hand and does not leave marks on the child. If all this data exists, then why do these systems that are supposed to protect them allow this?
That is an excellent question, and you are absolutely right. So a lot of people will say, oh, they made it against the law to physically discipline your kids. It's not true. Every single state has laws that define how to appropriately, and I use appropriately, like that, strike your child. You can hit your kid one way in Texas and get away with it, but if you try to do that same thing in Vermont or California, you could be arrested. So it varies. There's no universal agreement on what constitutes an appropriate way to hit your kid. And people are also, shocked to learn that 19 states still allow paddling in public schools. Most of them are in the South. I'll talk about that in a minute. And so my argument is that, it's a result of what I call childism, which is similar to racism, right? So hitting between adults is considered assault. It's legally defined as assault. You can't hit prisoners, right? You can be arrested for smacking a dog. If somebody sees you hitting a dog, you could be arrested. But we live in a society that has not evolved to see children as having the same right to bodily integrity as adults. And that's why it's not illegal to strike children. There is a lot of movement, and I know this to be the case also in California, where there are legislative officials who are trying to pass bills to get corporal punishment banned. It's been happening with schools, but also folks are pushing for it at the local and state level, particularly as there's more conversation about adverse childhood experiences, the sort of health outcomes of hitting kids, the behavioral outcomes that are associated with hitting kids. But I also argue too that because the future is Black and brown, because brown kids make up the majority of K-12 students, a racist society has a vested interest in making sure that parents traumatize their kids and coerce their kids and turn them into docile and obedient people who don't grow up to be able to think critically, to ask questions, to be radical, to push the envelope, and to subvert this racist system. So of course, let them beat their children, right? So I know there's a long-winded answer to your question, but that's where we are on that.
And I'm sorry, one more. Dr. James M. Thomas says, African schools spank their students and they come here to study. They excel here. I have a summer math camp and half of my students are African nationals. If the data is correct, why do they excel? A generation of white folks don't spank, but they are just as violent as they ever were.
So let me deal with the African part of this. The fact that these kids are excelling is not a result of people beating them. Right. And Africa has its own history of colonization as well. There's a lot of, African people who are on the continent spanked, beaten by their kids, by their parents, who deal with the same sorts of trauma and outcomes, sociological outcomes that we see here. The Africans who end up coming here for educational opportunities generally come from wealthier families, the families that have resources and the ability to send their kids here to study and so forth. That has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that they were beaten as kids. I hear this argument a lot that, I was whooped as a kid and I have a PhD, so that's a sign that, I'm successful. Or I was whooped as a kid, I'm not in jail. I'm the man or the woman I am today because my mama whooped me. And so I look at these people and I say, oh, so you agree with Massa's logic that in order to make, Black people successful, intelligent, law-abiding people, you have to process their bodies through violence. When we think about the educational space, and I want you guys to think about this for yourselves, when you are afraid and when you are feeling threatened, when your body is in pain, can you really learn? Can you really take in information? The answer is no. This works for children, and this is also true for adults, because that's not how the brain works. When you are afraid, when your body is in pain, the logic center, this prefrontal cortex area of your brain, becomes disconnected from the rest of your body. And so what happens is the back of your brain, the more primitive emotional center, allows you to feel things through your senses, meaning flee, fight, or freeze. You're not taking in any information at all. What's happening is your body is going into survival mode. It's about, how do I deal with this trauma? How do I survive? How do I get away from it? You're not taking in any new information whatsoever. So this idea that beating is connected to intellectual, success and academic achievement is absolutely false. Because if that were the case, then, Black and brown folks should be totally excelling. There should be no achievement gap. There should be no racial disparities in terms of prisons. So people say, well, we whip our kids to keep them out of prisons. Well, how is that working for our communities, right? If whipping children was so successful at keeping Black and brown communities out of prisons, then we wouldn't be having conversations about mass incarceration and police brutality or the achievement gap. If whipping was a prerequisite for success for Black and brown communities, then quite frankly, we should be ruling the world. We should be ruling this country. And all the socioeconomic indicators indicate that we are not. Okay. All right. So let me move forward on this. So what do we talk about decolonizing Black parenting? This is just not just for Black parents as well. This is, for BIPOC communities. It means that we have to understand how parenting practices have been formed by systems of oppression, slavery, Jim Crow, immigration crackdowns, all of that, genocide. All of this affects not only how parents think about and relate to their children, but also themselves, which affects not only how parents think about and relate to their children, but themselves. It means that we must understand how toxic European concepts about childhood and practices toward children got absorbed into our culture. Let me give you a few quick examples. So, a lot of parents of color think it's disrespectful for their children to roll their eyes at them or to suck their teeth. They just think it's disrespectful. Now, I know for West Africans, and I choose West Africans because that's the majority, where the majority of African Americans came from. Sucking one's teeth and rolling their eyes was a valid form of communication. This is pre-colonial, right? I don't know how many of you have ever watched, West African films, but all you hear is sucking teeth, rolling their eyes. It's a form of communication. But in the context of slavery, it got reconstituted as disrespect and had to be beaten out of enslaved folks. I talk to parents all the time who beat their daughters for twerking. And I'm like, why would you beat your daughter for twerking? Women of color throughout the diaspora have been twerking for millennia. They did this as part of rite of passage rituals, communicating with the gods for, fertility, those sorts of things. This is an old practice. But in this European white supremacist, toxic, spiritually dead context, our dance got demonized as sexually loose, right? And so we absorb that, we internalize these European ideas about what children should do and not do. And so we end up beating our children for doing things that are very natural to our culture. We beat kids because of their sexuality, right? And so we think that, homosexuality and trans folks and, bisexual folks, all intersex people, that was un-African, that was foreign to Africa, that was imported to Africa by Europe. It's absolutely untrue, right? People were, considered two-spirited, doubly blessed if they, were transgender or, embraced other identities. They were not demonized, but it was during the process of colonization, converting us to Christians, that all these fluid identities and understandings about our bodies and about our children and how we expressed ourselves sexually got corrupted and colonized. And so that infected the ways in which we raise our own children. So decolonization invites us to understand that white supremacy depends on Black and Brown and other indigenous parental coercion and violence against children in order to reproduce itself, so that we raise generations of broken and docile children who project their trauma and rage back onto themselves rather than onto their oppressor. Corporal punishment of children perpetuates anti-Blackness, self-hatred, right? Parents are often the first to teach their children to internalize their own oppression, right? Parents are often the first to prime their children to be perpetrators of violence and future victims as well, okay? And so this is what we call white body supremacy, right? Harsh punishment is deemed necessary to keep young people safe from deadly abuse by police and other authorities, right? And all of this is contradicted by evidence that would suggest that the responsibility for punishing Black bodies has been delegated from white society to Black families, right? We actually believe that beating kids is some kind of valid and effective civil rights strategy, and it is not. Okay, beating children didn't save them from being beaten on plantations, didn't save them from being killed in that context, didn't save them from being lynched, has not saved Black people from being shot and killed by police officers. Okay. And so what we do is we extend the legacy of the slave master when we beat our children, producing the very docility, trauma, and negative individual public health outcomes that are required to sustain this racial order. This racial order requires that we are unhealthy psychologically, physically, and how we relate to each other within our family context and in our communities. It's young people like you who can be at the forefront of decolonizing and healing all of this. So that means that you have to have some uncomfortable conversations about this parenting practice. You have to reject the idea that beating someone is a form of love. When parents hit their children, or you hit your own children in the future, what you're actually teaching is that people who love each other solve problems with violence, through violence, right? So a few years ago, I wrote this viral piece for the New York Times about beating children. And I argued that spanking kids, whipping kids is a byproduct of slavery, colonialism, indoctrination into Western Christianity, and internalized racism. And I argued that whipping a Black child, this is the same for other communities of color, whipping your child is one of the whitest things that you can do to harm your child, spiritually, intellectually, physically. Right? And then I wrote more about pediatricians, particularly Black pediatricians, who took an oath to do no harm, who pushed back against the AAP, which was armed with decades of research to say this is harmful to kids. But these pediatricians, these Black pediatricians, rejected the message. There's this myth that spanking is a Black thing. It's not true. When we look at the data on attitudes about spanking, right? And particularly this category over here by race and origin. So they surveyed white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, and American Indians. And what you see here is that the majority of parents across race and ethnicity, with the exception of Asians, believe in spanking. There's not a huge statistical difference here. So what this says is that the majority of American parents believe in hitting children. The latest data is somewhere around 70%. 70% of American children are growing up being hit by the people who are supposed to love and protect them. 70%, 70%, right? And some are starting to hit their kids before they even learn how to speak, popping them when they're a few months old, haven't even developed language centers or understanding in their brain. And so those pops, that cortisol, that rush of hormones is already starting to impact that child's brain development, speech, cognition, memory, emotional regulation, learning, all of these things. So we start foreclosing opportunities. What they're doing is wiring children's brain to avoid pain and punishment instead of learning and communication skills. And we see that showing up later. By the time they're in kindergarten, there's already a language gap. There's behavioral problems, which sets kids up for problems, particularly in a racist K-12 system where you have teachers who are majority white and female, who have cultural biases, who aren't committed to these communities that they teach in, are sometimes afraid of adolescents of color. And so we see high rates of school suspensions, expulsions, and school arrests, because you got traumatized kids coming into the classroom with all of this aggression and behavioral issues that got started when they were infants, and you had parents who were hitting them. And so, more data on this, that people are spanking their kids as young as 3 months old, right? 30% of 1-year-olds spanked at least once a month, right? So we see these kids who are starting off life with pain and coercion under, this idea that their parents are teaching them and protecting them and trying to love them. 90% of a child's brain development happens before age 5. So these are the parts of the brain that are responsible for all of these, behaviors and your ability to control your impulse, to plan, memory, abstract thinking, all of that. And so when you hit children very early on, you are sabotaging the brain's ability to do all of these things. Even if you don't leave a bruise or any other kind of injury, this is what spanking does to the brain. Another myth: because America is a mean and racist society, children must be whooped to prepare them for survival. So if I don't whoop my child, the police will arrest, beat, or kill them. We saw that in those videos, some of the video footage that I showed early. So parents think my kind of violence against my child is the good kind. So the thinking is, well, if I whoop my child, at least they're going to survive it. If the police or somebody else, a racist, gets a hold of my child and beats them, they might actually kill them. So I don't know how many of you have heard of W.E.B. Du Bois. Hopefully, if you take a really good history class, you'll learn about this great man. He was a civil rights leader, loved children. So in 1904, he writes, "There's no place in this world for Black children." So he's looking around America, he's seeing lynchings, he's seeing racial violence, discrimination. And he's also documenting the treatment of children of color. A few years later, he writes, "Is it worthwhile? Ought children be born to us? Have we any right to make human souls face what we must face?" So now he's questioning whether parents of color should even give birth. Should we bring them into such an ugly, violent, racist society? This gripe from W.E.B. Du Bois is something that generations of parents have, asked these same questions and felt these same fears. And so because of racism, we unfortunately embrace something called preparatory violence. I have to, use a negative to prevent a future negative. We saw this happening after Trayvon Martin's death, when George Zimmerman was acquitted of stalking him and killing him. There were parents all across this country who were saying they were afraid to have a child. There were white parents who adopted Black children or had biracial children who were saying the same thing. I'm afraid to have a child because they could, the justice system sent the message that it's okay to kill them. Then we saw other headlines. Adrian Peterson, Minnesota Viking football player, who hit his toddler son and actually lacerated his genitals. Lots of people came to his defense to say this is good Black parenting. He had to teach his son a lesson. Then there was Toya Graham, people called her a hero. It wasn't racist policing that was the problem. It wasn't, if you ride around Baltimore City, decades of divestment in housing and schooling and resources. It was none of that structural stuff. Black children, like her son, were the true enemy of peace. And she was celebrated for this. And this image down here, this is a still from a Facebook Live video where a father decided to strap on some boxing clubs to teach his son about skipping school. And so the father was twice the size of this boy. And, he punched him so bad, opened up his face, there's blood on the wall, blood on his shirt. And there were people in the comments. That's right. That's a good Black father right there. We've got to teach this boy some responsibility and how to be a man. Once again, we see Toya Graham. I don't want him to be a Freddie Gray. She didn't want her son to end up being killed. When Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, we saw more headlines like this about teenagers who were killed by cops. So all these parents see these headlines and it creates this ecosystem of fear. And parents feel like, well, the one way I could keep my child safe is to crack down on them. But here's the facts. Yes, go ahead.
Dr. Patterson, I just want you to know we only have about 5 more minutes.
Okay.
And this information is so great. And I don't know if you're following the chat, but
I
this
can't see the
discussion
chat.
is amazing. I know you can't see it. Would you be willing to come back for another session where we just talk about this, and we can talk about like a lot of the things that came up in the chat, and really just really talk about it some more, because I just feel like we cannot do justice.
Well,
and
how about this? How about I share the slides with y'all? And so whoever's organizing this, so because there's lots more information on here about school to prison pipeline, that sort of thing. And then maybe the last few minutes, I could just answer some questions.
Okay, that'd be great. Okay. I see a lot of like really like passionate debate in the chat. Anybody want to ask your question to Dr. Patton?
Well, you know, I got to ask my question. as the Christian pastor, Pan-African professor, and activist, I got to ask my question.
Sure.
You know, and basically, and I have to give my impression. First of all, I love the data. However, I would say a couple of things. One, the field of psychology hasn't been historically the best for Black people in terms of trying to figure out what our pathology is. And that's always their ploy. The field of psychology has failed, and we often fail to point out the collective pathology that exists among white folks. And as I put in the chat, if we fix them, we wouldn't have any problems. And so I said I'm gently pushing back, because there's a way in which poverty plays into all of this. And we never get to that. And there's a way in which parents could leave here saying that, oh my God, I've scarred my kids, or, oh my God, I bought into white supremacy because I've spanked my kids, as you would probably presume that I did. and I'm the poster, you know, I have a, you know, and I was the one that mentioned the camp. It's the Africans who say this, that the reason that they are so focused, the reason that they are so disciplined. I was on a chat with about 200 African nationals who tend to think that in America, students aren't as respectable as they are in Africa. I had to push back against that kind of talk as well. And so I guess my question is, as a parent, for me, everybody's household is different. Every child is different. For me, it is also colonizing when, and again, I can have some agreement with you in terms of just your position and your expertise. But these academic disciplines have been colonized to the hilt. And so while we can utilize the literature, and I think that it's important, I don't think that we need to paint with a broad brush that parents, Black parents in particular, have been far better parents than, and I'm making a generalization, but I want my point to be heard, than white parents. Because look at what we've been able to do and how we've been able to get our kids to that next level, lacking all possible resources and against all odds. And so
Dr. Thomas, let me show you something that's actually going to align. I'm going to show you a few quick slides here that actually, if I had enough time to get through this, would actually demonstrate your point. These are old historic images from Europe that show how whites treated children. So you can see in there images where they're slaughtering kids, right? In these horrible scenes, right? And so you have Europeans for centuries were actually awful parents. They were actually awful. They treated children with disrespect. They murdered them. They didn't even recognize that children were actually biologically different from adults. And so these are people who had for millennia all of this trauma embedded in their bodies. And they carried that trauma across the ocean, across into other cultures that they, interacted with, right? And so there's a great book called My Grandmother's Hands that goes into this in much more detail. And it is that trauma that has activated their racism and barbarism and their interactions with other people. So to your point, yes. And yes, if we were able to deal with white folks and their trauma and purge all of that, then we wouldn't have, so much trauma in communities of color. So I wish I could have gone much longer to get deeper into the cultural stuff to address the issues that you're bringing up, because I think you would be a lot more settled in your thinking about this. So I'm happy to share this information and to come back in the future to explain in more detail.
Thank you so much. And as a matter of fact, I mean, if you're really willing, in the next couple of months, I really would like to just have a session just around this for about 2 hours, 2.5 hours.
Absolutely.
Talk about this issue. And thanks for sharing, because I feel like we only really scratch the surface, and it's just so much. So thank you so much, Dr. Patton. I mean, you just were awesome.
Thank you for having me.
And to be continued, definitely to be continued. Everybody be on the lookout for the email. Once we get a date set, we will be having that.
Yeah, I agree. Can we please all give Dr. Patton a hand, and also feel free to show your appreciation in the chat also. That was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. Definitely needs to be continued. It's a great conversation to have.